Welcome back. Last time we took a pause in our chronological narrative to look at life in Anglo-Saxon England in the 7th and 8th centuries. We looked at life from a material point of view, but also from a spiritual point of view. But this time we're going to pick up the narrative again. We're going to look at how the center of political gravity shifted in the 8th century. In the 7th century, Northumbria had been the most powerful kingdom. But in the 8th century, you see the rise of the kingdom of Mercia in the middle part of England. Mercia takes over as the rising power. And then in the early 9th century, Wessex takes over from Mercia. But things got difficult for all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in the 9th century because of the Vikings. And the arrival of the Vikings is a major watershed in English history. It's the second of the great transformations that we've seen. The first was, of course, the end of Roman rule in Britain and the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons. In this lecture, we're going to see the Vikings arrive on the scene. And in the next lecture, we're going to look at the first really effective effort to cope with the Vikings. And this led directly to the unifying of all the English kingdoms under one dynasty. So the Vikings are really responsible in the end for the creation of the single kingdom called England. So we're going to be talking about Vikings a lot for the next 2 lectures. But let's start with what's going on in English politics. When we talked about the conversion of England to Christianity 2 lectures ago, we spent most of our time talking about Northumbria. In the 7th century and into the early 8th century, the kingdom of Northumbria is the most powerful kingdom in England. Then Northumbria goes into a decline. Now this could happen rather quickly to an Anglo-Saxon kingdom, and in this case, it was a lack of leadership. If you have a series of ineffectual kings, the kingdom loses momentum, and that's what happens to Northumbria in the early 8th century, and the torch is passed to Mercia. Now you may remember that last time I talked about a Mercian king. He was assassinated in 757, probably as part of a private feud that he'd gotten mixed up in. Well, he is replaced on the throne by one of the truly great Anglo-Saxon kings, a man named Offa. And Offa's reign is a good example of how important leadership was. His rule lasted nearly 4 decades, and during that time, Mercia was unquestionably the most important, most powerful of all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. After his reign, the momentum is going to shift south again to Wessex. But I think all this talk of momentum and power begs an important question. What makes a king powerful in Anglo-Saxon England? Well, one of the big indicators of how powerful you are is how much tribute you can collect. In the last lecture, we talked about kings collecting tribute from their own lands. Tribute is simply the money that you can get people to pay you, essentially so that you will leave them alone. There's an implicit deal here. If you give tribute, you're going to get protection in exchange. But it's not really a voluntary arrangement. It's glorified protection money. This is how kings support themselves. But the really powerful kingdoms are able to get other kingdoms to pay them tribute. And the justification is the same as it is with individual people within your own kingdom. The kingdom collecting tribute is going to protect the kingdom paying tribute from its enemies. Really, though, the kingdom exacting the tribute is the enemy that the weaker kingdom needs protection from. Well, Offa of Mercia is very good at exacting tribute. And he's able to do this because success breeds success. He attracts a lot of good soldiers because they figure they're going to have successful careers with Offa. They're going to make a lot of money. And if Offa shows up with these very able soldiers, you're going to think it's a good idea to pay tribute to him. Now, Offa was very systematic about this process of collecting tribute, and we have a great record of the tribute he collected. It's from a document called the Tribal Hidage. And it's a record of what the different kingdoms in southern and central England had to pay to Offa. Now, what's a hide? A hide is a unit of land. It's notionally the amount of land one family needs to farm in order to sustain itself. Now, the hide could vary in size depending on what part of the country you're in, because the landscape varies, the soil varies, so you might need a bigger hide in some areas than you do in others. We're going to meet hides again later on in the course, but for now, it's just important to know that it's a unit of land, and Offa is using that unit to assess the amount of tribute that is owed to him. So much per hide of land. So Offa has a revenue stream coming in from the other kingdoms in England. What does he do with it? He seems to have been the first king in English history to invest massively in public infrastructure. He built a huge earthwork on the western border of Mercia, the border with Wales, and it became known as Offa's Dyke. And it's enormous. It is certainly the longest defensive structure built in Britain since Hadrian's Wall and the Antonine Wall in the 2nd century. It runs north to south for over 70 miles. Large sections of it are still visible. It also seems to have been built with great care. The route of the wall takes advantage of the natural contours of the land so that the dike always gives a view to the west that will guard against surprise attack from Wales. Now, Offa's Dyke does raise an interesting point. Obviously, Offa has not been able to impose tribute on the Welsh, and it's worth remembering that Celtic fringe could be pretty stubborn. But Offa is going to make very sure that the Welsh don't cause him any trouble. Building the dike is a way of protecting his investment. Because if the Welsh ravage the lands of western Mercia, if they plunder and burn, there is going to be less tribute coming in for Offa. So it's worth his while to build this dike. Another very interesting aspect of Offa's reign is that Offa is the only Anglo-Saxon king who corresponded with Emperor Charlemagne. Charlemagne wanted some help in a church dispute that he was involved in. There was a controversy over the veneration of images, and he wanted Offa's help in getting the English church to take his side. Charlemagne even referred in one letter to Offa as his friend. And so he's kind of trying to butter Offa up. Now, relations between the two kings were not always harmonious. There were several times that they broke off contact with each other for years at a time. But there was serious talk at several points of a marriage alliance between the two royal families. And even though it didn't come to anything, that's an indication of how prestigious Offa was. In a sense, it's a sign of importance that Offa and Charlemagne were even able to be offended by each other. But alas, talent does not seem to have run in the Mercian royal family, and the people who succeeded Offa in Mercia are really nobodies. And here we see again that the quality of royal rulership is absolutely crucial. There's really not a whole lot of administrative machinery to back it up. You follow a king because you are impressed with him, not because there is any kind of abstract state apparatus that is up and running regardless of the person in charge. For example, if the reeves, the people running the estates, if they're not afraid of the king, they're just going to steal from him when he isn't around, and there isn't going to be much tribute to collect. If the king isn't a ruler that other warriors respect, they won't turn out and fight for him, and his lands will get attacked. So if you have one incompetent king, that can spell doom for a royal dynasty. So the initiative shifts after Offa's death. It shifts to the Kingdom of Wessex in the southwest. And there are several reasons why Wessex becomes the next great Anglo-Saxon power. One reason is that Wessex still has room to expand to the west and gobble up more territory. Mercia had gone about as far west as it could. We can see that from Offa's Dyke. But during this period, the Wessex kings are slowly but surely conquering the southwestern peninsula of Britain that contains Devon and Cornwall. And by the early 9th century, Wessex has finally conquered Cornwall completely. Now, these are areas still inhabited by Celtic peoples, and in fact, Cornish, the language of Cornwall, which is very similar to Welsh, Cornish was spoken in Cornwall until the 18th century. But what this means, this conquest of Cornwall, is that now you've got new land. You can give it out to followers. You have new tribute to exact. And this is one of the best ways for an economy to grow in the early medieval period. You just conquer more territory and you get control of more people. But I think the crucial factor is leadership. Wessex produces a series of very able leaders in the 9th century. The first of these is King Egbert of Wessex. He's the one who conquers Cornwall. He rules from 802 to 839. So he takes power only a few years after Offa of Mercia dies in 796. Egbert comes from a branch of the Wessex royal family that had been in eclipse for a long time. So he is obviously pretty impressive. He manages to get himself back into power, and he has to then rebuild his power base. But he does it very successfully. And in 825, he goes up against Mercia, and he wins. He beats the Mercian army at the Battle of Ellendon, and as a result, he really, at one blow, he takes over the whole Mercian hegemony that had been established in the 8th century over the southern part of England. All of the English kingdoms that had been paying tribute to Offa, now they're going to pay tribute to Wessex. And this includes the Mercian overlordship of the city of London. Now, Mercia gets it back a few years later. So it goes back and forth between Mercia and Wessex. It's a prize to be competed for, and it's an indication of how important London is. And we're going to talk more about London in the next lecture. So Egbert is a successful king, and his heirs are successful kings, and the initiative is definitely with Wessex from now on. But just as Wessex is struggling with Mercia, a new threat appears in the island of Britain. Raiders from Scandinavia begin attacking Britain in the late 8th century. No one's sure exactly why they appear at precisely this time. It's sort of more or less out of the blue. Scholars think it's possible that they've been driven by a scarcity of resources at home. Scandinavia can be a very tough place to make a living, at least under pre-modern conditions. There's just not a lot of good farmland. Certainly, what these raiders are after is plunder, but also trade to a certain extent. They're willing to make money however they can. But these raiders are, of course, the people that we typically refer to as the Vikings. Now, I need to point out, they would never have called themselves that. Viking was an Old Norse word, and it meant to go out raiding. So it was a verb. It wasn't a noun, it was a verb. It described an activity you engaged in. You went out a Viking, and then you went and did something else. For the Scandinavians themselves, this was a perfectly straightforward career choice. The Anglo-Saxons also didn't call them Vikings. They actually called them Northmen, because they came out of the north. And of course, the Vikings themselves would have just called themselves Olaf, or Egil, or whatever their names were. But we're going to go ahead and call them the Vikings. It's something we're used to, and we're going to stick with it. Now, at first, nobody knew how serious this threat was going to be. In 787, 3 longships appeared off the Dorset coast in Wessex, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle just notes that this was the first time the ships of the Northmen were seen off the English coast. But they were a harbinger of things to come. The most famous Viking raid of this period, the one for which we have a lot of evidence, happened in 793. In that year, the monastery of Lindisfarne, off the coast of Northumbria, was attacked, and this seems to have sent a shockwave all over England, but also Europe as well, because Lindisfarne was such a famous monastery. This was the monastery founded by St. Aidan out of Iona that had converted much of England to Christianity, so it's kind of the mother church of a lot of England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle entry for 793 records terrible portents in Northumbria that year, including fiery dragons flying through the air. Then there was a famine. And then to top it all off, says the Chronicle, the raiding of the heathen miserably devastated God's church in Lindisfarne Island by looting and slaughter. So that's pretty bad. But the most influential account of the raid on Lindisfarne is the one that we have preserved in a letter that was written to the Lindisfarne community after the raid to console them. The letter came from a cleric named Alcuin. He was a Northumbrian by birth, but he'd spent much of his career at the court of Charlemagne. Charlemagne had assembled a kind of dream team of intellectuals. He would go all over Europe and he would recruit the best and the brightest wherever he could find them. And Alcuin fit the bill. He'd been educated in Northumbria. It was still the period of the Northumbrian Renaissance. He was actually born in 735, the same year that the Venerable Bede died. Then, of course, Alcuin goes off to the continent, but he keeps in touch with his homeland. And when he found out about what had happened at Lindisfarne, this was a place he knew very well, he was devastated. And he wrote to the community in agonized terms. First, he described the terrible desecration of the church that the Vikings had supposedly carried out. Supposedly, they trampled on the bodies of the saints like dung in the street. And Alcuin goes on to utter a cry of despair. What assurance is there for the churches of Britain if St. Cuthbert, with so great a number of saints, defends not his own? Now, St. Cuthbert is a saint I mentioned in the last lecture who went around ministering to humble people in England, and he's the saint to whom Lindisfarne was dedicated. Now, being a good Christian, Alcuin can't leave it there. He has lots of encouraging things to say about God chastising the ones he loves, etc., etc. But still, you get the sense that the whole experience has been pretty horrific for all concerned. And we have visual evidence to go with these texts. There's a carved stone called the Lindisfarne stone, and it may have been erected at Lindisfarne to commemorate the victims of the raid. It's badly damaged. Only the top part of the stone survives. But on one side, you can clearly see a group of men carrying out an act of violence, perhaps directed against monks. They're certainly holding weapons. On the other side of the stone, you see the Last Judgment. So that's how cataclysmic this raid is seen to be. Now, there has been an effort recently among scholars to try to rehabilitate the Vikings. And this new argument runs that our picture of the Vikings, how devastating they are, is distorted because of the fact that they tend to target churches. Churches are good targets. They have lots of valuable objects in them, things used in the liturgy, gold chalices, that sort of thing. And other people even stored their valuables there sometimes. So if you asked the Vikings, why do you attack churches? They'd probably say essentially what Dillinger said about robbing banks, because that's where the money is. And most of the texts that we have were written by churchmen like Alcuin, and churchmen, of course, are concerned about what happens to other churchmen, and they're far more likely to keep this record of doom and gloom. So a lot of modern scholars point out that there are many Vikings who are engaged in peaceful trading as well as raiding. They would trade and or raid as the situation called for. Now, this is all true. But I don't think we should minimize the psychological impact of raids like the one on Lindisfarne. They just weren't supposed to happen. The saints were supposed to protect you, and so they call into question a lot of assumptions about how the world is supposed to work. How safe is anyone if the monks of the Holy Isle are vulnerable? But the Lindisfarne raid is just the first of many. At first, the Vikings raid in a very scattershot fashion. They'll strike at various points around the British Isles and in Ireland, usually in small groups. No more than a few longboats each, holding maybe 40 to 60 men apiece. These are smash and grab raids, very much like the ones that we talked about at the time when Roman rule in Britain is declining. Again, the target of these raids is plunder, but besides plunder, the Vikings are also very interested in slaves. They are very big slave traders. And there's a wonderful story that illustrates how the slave trade is just a fact of life in this period, and the Vikings just insert themselves into it. It's about an Irishman named Murragh. He's captured by Viking raiders in Ireland. He's taken to Northumbria, where he's sold to a group of nuns. Now, notice, the nuns have slaves. They don't mind buying them from Vikings. But apparently, things get a little too cozy between Murragh and some of the nuns. this is discovered, and as punishment he is put in a boat and set adrift. Whereupon he gets captured by another group of Vikings who sell him again. And at long last, he makes his way back to Ireland. He's reunited with his long-suffering wife and ends his days as a teacher of Latin. Now, the kind of raids that Murrah falls victim to are really characteristic of the early period of Viking activity, and this phase of small-scale raiding lasts for a few decades. But starting in about the 840s, the scale of Viking operations changes. Vikings begin to consolidate their forces. They form much larger fleets. And this is a really dramatic transition. We start out with small groups, maybe a few ships, maybe 100 or so men. In the 840s, you start to see fleets of 50 to 60 boats, and they would carry maybe 1,000 men or more. Now, what has changed is that the leaders of the Vikings have arisen who are personally charismatic, and they have the organizational talent to hold such a huge enterprise together from year to year. Before this, these small-scale groups would raid for a summer, and then they might go their separate ways. Now you start to see groups that coalesce, and they form a kind of a group identity with loyalty to a particular leader. Some of these leaders were obviously very formidable figures indeed. The great army that descends on England in the middle of the 9th century is led by a trio of brothers, the sons of Ragnar. And the fiercest of these was reputed to be a guy named Ivar the Boneless. Now, nobody knows exactly what that nickname means. What does that mean that he's the Boneless? It's one of those real puzzles of medieval history. There are all sorts of speculations about what it meant. One of these possibilities is too rude for me to explain. But one thing we can be pretty sure of, Ivar the Boneless is not a nice guy, and he's scary enough to attract a lot of other very scary guys to follow him. So this is a very different kind of enemy. On the one hand, an enemy like this is a bigger target. You could see it coming. It's not like the little raids. They might come upon you with no warning. But you do have warning that one of these giant Viking armies is on its way. You can't avoid it. That's the good news. The bad news is that there's not a lot you can do to stop it. In 850, a large group of Danish Vikings spends the winter on the island of Thanet. And this is a major turn of events. Up until this point, as I said, you might get Viking raiders staying for a summer, but they then split up and go home. In 850, for the first time, we see a group of Vikings that doesn't split up, does not go back to Scandinavia. Instead, they stay right in easy reach of England, and they're clearly just waiting for a break in the weather before they get down to business, and that's just what happens. When the spring comes, the Viking army comes ashore. The Vikings raid Canterbury, they raid London, they drive the King of Mercia out of the city. They do suffer defeat at the hands of the army of Wessex, so they're not unbeatable, but they're a very big problem, and they continue to be a problem. Now, there was some turnover in the leadership of this force, and they don't spend all their time in England. They go back and forth to the continent. But in 865, a new and improved Viking army arrives. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls this the Michel Hera, the Great Army, or just the army. And this time, the Vikings seem to have been interested not just in raiding, but in actual conquest. And one by one, they conquer all the English kingdoms except for Wessex. They start with Deira, the southern part of Northumbria that's centered on York. That's their first successful conquest. But the most gruesome accounts that we have of this process have to do with the conquest of East Anglia in 869. Some of the details are from later sources. We probably shouldn't trust them completely. But I'm going to tell the story because it goes into the myth of the Vikings in England that the English liked to believe. Supposedly, King Edmund of East Anglia was captured by the great Viking army led by Ivar the Boneless, and Ivar asked Edmund to renounce his faith in Christ. Of course, Edmund refused, so Ivar first had him scourged, and then shot with arrows, and then finally beheaded. But his head was preserved in a rather unusual way. A wolf got a hold of it, And miraculously, we're told, even though the wolf was hungry, it didn't eat the head. And later on, some English people are able to manage to get the head out of the wolf's jaws, and they reunite it with the body. And later, the monks of Bury St. Edmunds in Suffolk claim that they have King Edmund's body. And supposedly, you could still see the little red line around his neck where his head had been miraculously reattached to his body. Well, that charming story is meant to kind of give a religious gloss to an event that probably really has nothing to do with religion at all. I doubt that Ivar the Boneless cared one way or the other whether Edmund renounced Christ. He just wanted to conquer East Anglia. King Edmund lost, the Vikings won, that's the end of it. And the consequences for England are momentous, because now almost all of the eastern seaboard of England is in Viking hands. And now something new happens. Large numbers of Scandinavians come to settle in England. The men of the great army send home to Denmark for their wives, their children, their retainers, whoever they can get to come follow them to England to settle. The Vikings are settling down. Yorkshire and East Anglia are swamped by Danish settlers, and you can see the results of this settlement just by looking at a map of England. This part of England has a large number of place names that end in B or Thorpe, like Grimsby or Althorpe. These are suffixes that can denote a settlement started by a certain person. So Grimsby would be the settlement of the man named Grim. And Thorpe is related to the German word Dorf, which means village. So you get lots of these names in this part of England. Parts of central and eastern Mercia also have lots of settlers come in, not as densely as in Yorkshire, but still very substantial numbers. And that's because the Vikings didn't conquer Mercia, they simply made a deal with the king of Mercia, a guy named Ceolwulf. Ceolwulf is perhaps not the greatest hero in English history. It doesn't really look that great when your response to the Vikings is to let them take half your kingdom so that you get to cling rather miserably to the other half for a few more years. That's what Ceolwulf did. And it meant that some of the richest land in Mercia is open to settlement. Now, the lands that the Vikings got in this agreement with Mercia became known as the area of the 5 boroughs, because they included the 5 towns of Lincoln, Stamford, Nottingham, Leicester, and Derby. Lincoln, Stamford, Nottingham, Leicester, and Derby. So those areas also get lots of Danish settlers. Now, the cultural impact of the Danish settlement is tremendous. In this area, land came to be measured according to Danish units, not English ones. You'll remember I talked earlier about King Offa's tribal hidage, the record that he kept of all the tribute owed to him by the other English kingdoms, and the land was measured in hides. Well, in the areas of Danish settlement, they don't use hides anymore. They use a Danish unit called the carucate, which denotes the land that one plow could be expected to keep under cultivation. There's another larger unit of land, an administrative unit that is used in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms called the hundred. It's supposedly derived from 100 hides of land. We're going to be talking a lot more about hundreds in a later lecture, but for right now, I just want to introduce them to say that in the Danish parts of England, they don't use hundreds anymore. They use a Danish unit called the wapentake. This came from a Danish term that meant the showing of weapons, and it probably meant some sort of occasion when all the able-bodied men are supposed to show up and demonstrate that they've got the proper weapons for self-defense. So these very basic things, what you call places, how you divide up the land, these things are changed by the settlement of the Danes in eastern England. And of course, other things changed too. The Danish settlers want to follow their own legal customs, so in these areas, the law is Danish law, not English law. As a result, later on, this part of England, roughly the Danish areas from east of Watling Street, these areas come to be called the Danelaw. Now, many of the Danes who settle are just interested in getting on with the task of making a living. And we know there is substantial intermarriage and other kinds of contact between the Danish settlers and the native English. And one way we can tell this is by the very strong impact of the Vikings on the English language. Such a strong impact really only comes about if you have a substantial number of bilingual speakers. I already talked in the first lecture of this course about how many English pronouns are derived from Old Norse, words like this and they and them. But you have a lot of other very common words that are borrowed from Old Norse, and I'll just give you a brief sample of the kinds of very common English words that come from Old Norse. Anger, birth, dirt, gift, knife, law, leg, shirt, take, window, and there are many others. Now, it's common for languages to borrow specialized vocabulary from another language, particularly if that other language is acknowledged as having some sort of special competence. We have borrowed a lot of terms relating to cooking from French. We think of the French as people who know a lot about cooking. But if you're borrowing words for everyday objects, like parts of the body, leg, or very common articles of clothing, shirt, that means you're really living side by side with each other on a daily basis. So the Viking settlers did really become a part of life in England. But I've been talking about the peaceful legacy of the Vikings in England. This kind of assimilation that can leave traces in the English language, that only starts in the late 9th century. And that's because the Viking army isn't quite finished with England yet. There is one last kingdom to conquer, the Kingdom of Wessex. And in our next lecture, we'll see what happens to Wessex when it too comes under Viking attack. And we'll meet the greatest English hero of the age, King Alfred.